We're making our way through Second Samuel. We've gotten all the way up to chapter 18. Absalom killed. And it is actually a climax of the family problems and the national problems that David has to face thanks to his tryst to Bathsheba and his murder of Uriah. There'll be some other episodes, but this is the climax. The others are anticlimactic as we're going down through the last few years of David's life. We ended chapter 17, Mahanaim, two camps. Then David came to Mahanaim, two camps, and Absalom crossed the Jordan with all the men of Israel, and Israel and Absalom camped in the land of Gilead. Two camps. Genesis chapter 32 is Jacob. Jacob has an earthly camp, and he's also with the angels, a heavenly camp, so two camps. But also Jacob divides his entourage into two different groups, figuring if Esau kills off one group, he still has the other. So that particular name, from its first appearance all through Scripture, two camps. Now there's a little tidbit thrown in here that becomes interesting. Now Absalom had Amasa over the army instead of Joab. Amasa was the son of a man named Ithra the Ishmaelite, who had married Abigail, the daughter of Nahash, sister of Zeruiah, Joab's mother, which is a long way of saying that Joab and Amasa were cousins and both nephews of David. Now, the reason that's interesting is when David comes back over the Jordan to take over the kingdom again, he's going to do two things. Well, he's going to do one thing, but possible two motivations. He's going to make Amasa not just the commander over the northern tribes, but the commander over the entire nation. And there's two potential reasons for that. The one, it's a political reconciliation because the north was coming after him along with Absalom. But then secondly, he's got this grudge against Joab. And we're going to dive into that in more detail. Who was the first person to know of David's conspiracy with over Uriah? It was Joab. Joab got the letter that said, put Uriah up front and let him die. So Joab has the goods on David. David has now lost control. Joab could be into the world of extortion or whatever. The Bible doesn't talk about any of that, but Joab has the goods on David. And so we're going to find that David's going to snub Joab in a couple of ways as we get deeper into this process. And then David mustered the men who were with him and set over them commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds. And this is a millennia before the Romans took on the same situation between legions and cohorts and centuries. That's not 100 years, but 180 to 100 people that a centurion would rule. And to a certain extent, it continues into our army structure of today. And David sent out the army, 1/3 under the command of Joab, 1/3 under the command of Abishai, the two cousins, and 1/3 under Ittai the Gittite. And that's the guy who came in right after David left, and David said to him, you just proselyted from Gath and you're just starting with us. Why would you come with us? And he said, look, he all but quoted Ruth, let your people be my people, let your God be my God. And so David rewards him and puts him in charge of 1/3 of his army. And the king said, I myself will go out with you. That's an interesting turn of events from when he was up on the rooftop lusting after Bathsheba and his army was out fighting the battles. He says, I myself will go out with you. But the men said, notice it wasn't the generals alone, it was the men said, you shall not go out. For if we flee, they will not care about us. If half of us die, they will not care about us. But you are worth 10,000 of us. Notice that 20,000 are going to die in the battle. But you are worth 10,000 of us. Therefore, it is better that you send us help from the city. In other words, keep some soldiers back. You stay back. And if we need your help, we'll give you a buzz. The king said to them, whatever. So the king stood at the side of the gate while all the army marched out by hundreds and by thousands. The king is on the side of the gate so these troops can go out. we're going to see that once the troops are out and the battle's going out, David is sitting between the two gates, waiting for news. Why is he between the two gates? If he's on one side, somebody could slip by without him seeing them. He's going to stand dead center. He's going to sit dead center so that nothing gets past him. And the king ordered Joab and Abishai and Ittai, deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom. And all the people heard when the king gave orders to all the commanders about Absalom. Now that's important also. It wasn't like he called the three men into council and said, look, whatever you do, don't mess with my son. Everybody heard him say that. But the word of the Lord came to David. Now this is in First Chronicles, and it's going back to the time, 2 Samuel chapter 7, where God is giving him this covenant. The point is, as we go through these things, we're going to answer the question, why would David be ready to forgive Absalom? David was already told that Solomon would be the next king. So if he was assured that Solomon would be the next king, maybe his hope was that they could capture Absalom, they'd put him back in his house in Jerusalem where he sat for several years, being ignored by David. But for whatever reason, he says, don't mess with my son Absalom. But the word of the Lord came to David saying, you have shed much blood and have waged great wars. You shall not build a house to my name because you have shed so much blood before me on the earth. That's the context of what we're about to read. Behold, a son shall be born to you who shall be a man of rest. I will give him rest from all his surrounding enemies, for his name shall be Solomon. We're going to find that when David is on his deathbed, Adonijah, the other of the older sons, wants to jockey for position. Nathan comes in and he says, Solomon's supposed to be the next king. David affirms that promise, and Nathan makes sure that Solomon gets anointed. And so David knows who the next king is going to be. So there's some interesting dynamics there. Here's David. Here's Absalom. Absalom has created a revolt, a rebellion. Absalom has slept with those concubines, which in their culture means there's no turning back. And here's David ready to forgive him. Solomon shall build a house for my name. He shall be my son, and I will be his father, and I will establish his royal throne in Israel forever. Well, the royal throne didn't even last one generation because Solomon's son Rehoboam rejected the people from the north who said, can you please cut back our taxes? He said, my father whipped you with whips, I'll whip you with scorpions. And the kingdom was split. And we're going to be studying, months permitting, how these two kingdoms are going to degrade and degrade and degrade. But there was always a bloodline. Wasn't Solomon's bloodline. He comes down to Joseph. It was Nathan, a different Nathan, not the prophet, but one of the sons of Bathsheba comes down and becomes the bloodline to Mary. So the army went out into the field against Israel, and the battle was fought in the forest of Ephraim. So let's take a look at this. Everything starts in Jerusalem. Absalom with his chariot in the streets of Jerusalem, Absalom standing in the gate, winning the hearts of the people. Absalom goes down to Hebron, gets all the people to come up, and he's coming marching up out of Hebron towards Jerusalem. David leaves Jerusalem, crosses the Jordan, and he ends up in this city, this camp of the two camps, Mahanaim. And we just read here that there was a battle in the forest of Ephraim. Now, where that gets interesting is this. Ephraim's territory is on the west side of the Jordan. How did there get to be a forest of Ephraim on the east side? Well, I wrote to the rabbi, and he gave me this thing that everybody was allowed to pasture their sheep. When we get to studying the forest of Ephraim, my contention is nobody would want to pasture their sheep in that forest. In fact, we're going to read that more of the men died in the forest than they did by falling from the sword. It was that crazy of a place. So how did the forest of Ephraim on the east get that name when the Ephraimites' territory is on the west? Well, we have two references, Gideon and also Jephthah from the book of Judges. Gideon sent messengers throughout all the hill country of Ephraim, say, come down against the Midianites and capture the waters against them as far as Beth Barak and also the Jordan. So all the men of Ephraim were called out, and they captured the waters as far as Beth Barak and also the Jordan. No mention of them giving up the real estate that they captured. Fast forward from chapter 12 down to from chapter 7 to chapter 12, and there's Jephthah, and there's a contention among the tribes, and he wants to kill off the Ephraimites. And as they're wanting to cross this river, he sets them up, and he tells his soldiers, ask the Ephraimites to say Shibboleth. Well, they couldn't say it. They would say Sibboleth, and then they died. And so the forest of Ephraim on the east side. And the men of Israel were defeated there by the servants of David, and loss there was great on that day, 20,000 men. It doesn't say how much from either side. The 20,000 men die because of the revolt of Absalom. The battle spread over the face of all the country, and the forest devoured more people that day than the sword. And so there you have a modern day photograph of the forest of Ephraim. Now, we've got 3,000 years separating this battle from where we sit today. During those 3,000 years, when the Ottomans took over, they taxed Israel a tree tax. And so all of Israel became deforested. Fast forward today, the natural bioclimate allows that forest to grow back again. And Absalom just happened. God is so cool. Absalom happened to meet the servants of David, and Absalom was riding on his mule, and the mule went under the thick branches of a great oak, and his head was caught fast in the oak, and he was suspended between heaven and earth, while the mule that was under him went on. So we know Absalom had this great shock of hair. In fact, he cut it off once a year. If it was a locks for love, it was love for himself. It was a love for cancer victims. But he had a huge lock collection of hair, and he gets hung up in the tree. So there's another photograph. First of all, there was no horse involved. That looks a fine looking Arabian. There was a mule, okay? Second of all, somebody happens, again, there's that word, somebody happens to see him get tangled up. Now, we don't know if he was hanging from his hair and his hair was longer than his hands. We don't know if it was a little bit shorter and he has a hand on the branch and trying to untangle himself. We don't know. We don't know if he was doing that and trying not to scream because he's surrounded by David's forces. But anyway, he's trapped. And a certain man saw it and told Joab, behold, I saw Absalom hanging in an oak. Joab says, are you even kidding me? Then why did you not strike him there to the ground? I would have been glad to give you 10 pieces of silver and a belt. The man says, if I could feel in my hand the weight of 1,000 pieces of silver, I wouldn't touch this guy. Keep in mind, the king said, for my sake, protect the young man Absalom. On the other hand, if I did do him in, you would tuck tail and not defend me. And the king knows everything, and so I'm a dead duck. I'm not going to do that. Joab said, I'm not going to waste any more time with you. In the meantime, there's Absalom dangling. And Joab took 3 javelins in his hand and thrust them into the heart of Absalom while he was still alive in the oak. And 10 young men, Joab's armor bearers, surrounded Absalom and struck him and killed him. Now, there's no command to the armor bearers. They're just in the fever of this killing thing. And the armor bearers don't have swords of their own. It wasn't like they went up there with a sword and he becomes the first human pinata. That's not what happened. If they're carrying somebody else's armor, the only thing they get is bow and arrow. And even today, if there's a firing squad, they'll have one gun loaded with blanks, so that when they fire, there's always this thought, maybe I wasn't the guy who killed them. And so all these others shoot into this guy and he's dead. Then Joab blew the trumpet and the troops became back from pursuing Israel, for Joab said, restrain them. And even in the Civil War, they used trumpets to signal different things. Today, they use modern equivalents of walkie-talkies. And they took Absalom and threw him into a great pit in the forest and raised over him a great heap of stones, and all Israel fled, everyone to his own home. Now, if you happen to get to Israel, in the Kidron Valley is this, I'll call it, monument. Some would call it the Pillar of Absalom. Some would call it the Tomb of Absalom. Well, it is in fact a tomb because it was built to bury people. But Absalom didn't get to be buried there. He was buried in some pit in the forest of Ephraim. It would be Absalom built that as if the kings of Egypt would build the pyramid in anticipation of their own death. Now, Absalom in his lifetime had taken and set up for himself the pillar that is in the King's Valley, for he said, I have no son to keep my name in remembrance. And he called the pillar after his own name, and it is called Absalom's monument to this day. Not to today, and to the day of this writing. So David is going to hear of the death of Absalom. That's interesting. Ahimaaz is the son of Zadok. And keep in mind, what was his mission? David sent Zadok, the high priest, back to Jerusalem. He sent Hushai to collaborate against Ahithophel. And Hushai was supposed to tell Zadok anything he knew. Zadok was supposed to tell Ahimaaz, and Ahimaaz was supposed to tell David. So he already had his marching orders. He's supposed to be a reporter. So he comes and he says, let me run and carry news to the king that the Lord has delivered him from the hand of his enemies. And Joab said to him, you're not going to carry the news today. You may carry news another day, but today you shall carry no news because the king's son is dead. I'm sure each of you, I don't want to ruin the study by mentioning good news, bad news jokes, but you're familiar with those things, right? It's a good news, bad news situation. The good news is the battle was won. The bad news was your son died. Now, I wasn't alive during the time, but imagine the news coming back from the ocean. D-Day was launched and the Americans were victorious. The Battle of Midway is over and the Americans are victorious. Now, if one of your kids was on one of those landing crafts, or one of your kids was on one of those ships, you're going to ask the question, well, that's all fine, well, and good, but what about my kid? And David is just like that. The difference is many parents lost their sons on D-Day and Midway, but they weren't FDR. They were, I hate to say it, part of collateral damage. David has a bigger responsibility, and Joab is going to help him see that. Then Joab said to the Cushite, now, just matter-of-factly mentions this Cushite. This Cushite isn't mentioned anywhere at all from 1st or 2nd Samuel. If you're familiar with modern-day world-class marathons, it's typically somebody from Central Africa who wins those races. And it isn't a fluke. It's been that way for as long as I've been following the the Olympics and the marathons. And so they've got something going for them where they're ace long distance runners. So Joab says, I'm going to take one of these runners and I'm going to say, I want you to go and tell the king what you have seen. In the economy of the Mosaic Law, eyewitnesses were very important. None of this hearsay stuff. And that continues on to the courts today. There's no he said, she said kind of thing admissible. It's what have you seen or what have you heard? So Joab tells the Cushite, go and tell the king what you have seen. And the Cushite bowed before Joab and ran. Now Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said again to Joab, come what may. Come what may. Let me also run after the Cushite. What might come? The Ishmaelite told David that Saul had died. David killed the Ishmaelite. Is Joab trying to protect Ahimaaz? We don't know. But what he's suggesting is, hey, it's good news for the army, but it's bad news for the king. Ahimaaz says, come what may, let me also run after the Cushite. And Joab said, why will you run, my son, seeing that you will have no reward for the news? That's kind of a hint at the kind of motivations that Joab has, is doing things for rewards. Ahimaaz one more time, come what may, I will run. So Joab said, go ahead. Then Ahimaaz ran by the way of the plain and outrun the Cushite. So there again is the forest of Ephraim, and the king is hanging out at Mahanaim. And there's another photograph of the forest of Ephraim. Yeah, there are sections that are dense. There are sections that are hilly. And what does Ahimaaz do? He takes a different route down along the plain of Jordan, and he gets ahead of the Cushite. He's delivering the news. So now the scene shifts to Mahanaim. Now David was sitting between the two gates so nobody can get by. And the watchman went up to the roof of the gate of the wall, and when he lifted up his eyes, he looked and he saw a man running alone. Now that's a good sign as opposed to the whole army running back home, right? He sees a man running alone, and the watchman called out and told the king, and the king said, if he is alone, there's news in his mouth. And he drew nearer and nearer. The watchman saw another man running, and the watchman called to the gate and said, see, another man is running alone. And the king said, he also is bringing news. Good news, bad news. The watchman said, I think the running of the first is like the running of Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok. Now, we don't know if he was a track star. We don't know if he figured it out because he's holding up his priestly garments and trying to run. We don't know. But the watchman says, I think that's Ahimaaz, the guy that you charged to bring us news. And the king said, he's a good man and he comes with good news. Good men sometimes deliver bad news too. Think again about the parent of a child lost in war. And what's the worst thing that they could imagine? A military vehicle pulling up and an officer coming up, all dressed prim and proper. And he says, your son is gone. He's a good man and he comes with good news. And then Ahimaaz cried out to the king, all is well. And he bowed down before the king with his face to the earth and said, blessed be the Lord your God, who has delivered up the men who raised up their hand against my lord the king. Now he knows there are 20,000 dead, but he was not an eyewitness of Absalom. And the king said, is it well with the young man Absalom? Ahimaaz answered, when Joab sent the king's servant, your servant, I saw a great commotion, but I do not know for a fact what it was. Was he going to give him some speculation? We don't know because the next guy shows up. And the king says, turn aside and stand here because here comes somebody else. And behold, the Cushite came. And the Cushite said, "Good news for my lord the king, for the Lord has delivered you this day from the hand of all those who rose up against you." Again, plural. Ahimaaz said men, and this guy says of those who rose up against you. And the king said, "Is it well with the young man Absalom?" And the Cushite answered, "May the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up against you for evil be like that young man. He is dead." And the king was deeply moved and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And as he went, he said, "Oh, my son, Absalom, would I had died instead of you. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son." How was he expecting the battle to end? If he knew that Solomon was going to be the next king, if Absalom was going to win, Absalom would have come in and killed off the wives, killed off the sons, killed off the concubines, killed off anybody who might lay claim to the throne. And if David would win his forces, I guess he's expecting to put Absalom in prison or house arrest or whatever, because he knows it's going to be Solomon. And that brings us to chapter 19. Joab rebukes David. You've seen this slide before when we talked about the different friends as David is leaving Jerusalem. And we're going to talk now about this fifth one, where Joab is going to rebuke or give counsel to David. It was told Joab, "Behold, the king is weeping and mourning for Absalom." So the victory that day was turned into mourning for all the people. For the people heard that day, the king is grieving for his son. Now, many of you are old enough to remember when the Vietnam veterans came home from Vietnam. They did not come home to a victor's welcome. They came home to shame. And a lot of those guys never got over it. And so if you know a Vietnam vet, you can compare it to what these guys were coming home to. They fought the battle for the king. They win the battle. It wasn't their fault that Absalom got snuffed out, but yet they're coming back in shame. And the people stole into that city that day as people steal in who are ashamed when they flee in battle. And the king covered his face, and the king cried with a loud voice again, "Oh, my son, Absalom, oh, Absalom, my son, my son." There's not a parent in the world who wants to repeat that kind of a lament. Then Joab came into the house of the king and said, "You have today covered with shame the faces of all your servants, who have this day saved your life and the lives of your sons, including Solomon, and your daughters, and the lives of your wives and of your concubines, because you love those who hate you and hate those who love you. For you have made it clear today that commanders and servants are nothing to you. I don't care if the name is Joab. I don't care if it's Abishai. I don't care if it's Hittai. You don't care for any of those guys. For today I know that if Absalom were alive and all of us were dead today, then you would be pleased. Now therefore arise and go out and speak kindly to your servants. For I swear, if Absalom is dead and the armies reject David because he wouldn't do this, who would be the likely candidate to become the king? Who typically fills the void when there is trouble in the government? It's typically the military. And who's running the military? Joab. Joab has enough loyalty to the king at this point. He says, "If you do not go, not a man will stay with you this night, and this will be worse for you than all the evil that has come upon you from your youth until now." Because it's not going to be Amasa leading the charge, it's going to be me. And then the king arose and took his seat in the gate, and the people were all told, "Behold, the king is sitting in the gate." And all the people came before the king. Now, Israel had fled, every man to his own home. Now, when you're reading through things, you've got to understand, or try to understand, who they're talking about based upon the context. Sometimes when you hear Israel, you think about an individual from Genesis. His name was Jacob. Sometimes when you hear Israel, you think about all 12 tribes. Sometimes when you hear about Israel, it refers to the northern tribes. Sometimes when you hear Israel, it refers to the northern tribes plus Benjamin. So you got to think through these things. And when they say, now Israel had fled every man to his own home, the people that were only loyal to David at this point were a handful of Philistines and the tribe of Judah. So that means Benjamin was part of that. And all the people were arguing throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, the king delivered us from the hand of our enemies and saved us from the hand of the Philistines, and now he has fled out of the land from Absalom. But Absalom, whom we anointed over us, is dead in battle. Now, therefore, why do you say nothing about bringing the king back? So the people are looking for answers. They're looking for a leader, and they say, okay, we made a mistake. We anointed Absalom. Absalom's dead. He's got no sons to take his place. Why not David? And the king sent messengers to Zadok. Keep in mind, he's the high priest. He's still in Jerusalem. He sent messengers to Zadok and his sidekick Abiathar the priest. Say to the elders of Judah, why should you be the last to bring the king back to his house? Keep in mind, all the tribes are talking about doing this. And David's saying, you are my flesh and my bone. Why do you have to be the last collaborators? You're my brothers. You're my bone and my flesh. Why then should you be last? And say to Amasa, who up until this point was the commander-in-chief of the northern armies, and say to Amasa, are you not my bone and my flesh? He was his nephew. God do so to me and more also if you are not commander of my army from now on in place of Joab. A political reconciliation, and he's got it out for Joab. We're going to see what Joab thinks about that in a chapter or so. And he swayed the heart of all the men of Judah as one man, so that they sent word to the king, return both you and all your servants. So the king came back to the Jordan. So he's on the east side of the river. These people are coming down the Jericho turnpike from Jerusalem down to Jericho. They're coming into the plain. And so the king came back to Jerusalem, and Judah came to Gilgal to meet the king and to bring the king over the Jordan. Gilgal means circling or revolving. It's a turning point. And so once again, we have another turning point in the history of Israel where they're turning away from Absalom and back to David. Remember Shimei, the cursor? His name means hear me. So don't ignore me. I'm going to curse you. So listen to what I have to say. And Shimei, the son of Gera, the Benjaminite, he's still attached to the thought that Saul should be king. And Shimei, the son of Gera, the Benjamite from Bahurim, which means warlike, hurried to come down with the men of Judah to meet the king, and with him 1,000 men from Benjamin. David is not going to be a happy camper. There's been a revolt, and who is he going to do in because of the revolt? So the Benjaminites are coming. They're looking to protect themselves. Remember Ziba? Ziba is also coming down. Ziba was the guy, he fed David in his retreat, but he also lied about Mephibosheth. And Ziba, the servant of the house of Saul, with his 15 sons and his 20 servants, rushed down to the Jordan before the king. So you get all these Benjaminites, Shimei, Ziba, their helpers, several thousand, and they crossed the ford to bring over the king's household and to do his pleasure. Now, King James says ferry boat. And there's no ferry or boat in the Hebrew. So were the King James translators wanting to put a boat there because that was where Joshua and those guys crossed and it would minimize that crossing? Keep in mind that crossing was at harvest time, and that river went from 10 feet across to a half a mile across. For whatever reason, Josephus, not scriptural, said they built a deck of boats and David just marched along that deck. Possible. Walking through the river doesn't seem very kingly, but one way or the other, they're receiving him back onto the west side. And Shimei, the son of Gera, fell down before the king as he was about to cross the Jordan. And he said to the king, let not my lord hold me guilty. We're going to see in the next click, I have sinned. Let not my lord hold me guilty, or remember how your servant did wrong on the day my lord the king left Jerusalem. Do not let the king take it to heart. That's the same phrase that Tamar heard from Absalom when she was raped. And Absalom says, don't take it to heart. Here's David retreating, being stoned, being cursed at, surrounded by his mighty men. And David saying, the Lord is causing that to do that. Don't mess with him. For your servant knows that I have sinned. Therefore, behold, I have come this day, the first of all the house of Joseph. Here again is back to Israel, and what's he talking about? The house of Joseph. Joseph had two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, and many times Ephraim is used to refer to that collectively. But here he's saying Joseph. That includes Benjamin as well, because Benjamin was Joseph's only full brother. He says, I'm the first of all the house of Joseph, to all the 11 tribes, to come down to meet the Lord the King. And there in Joshua, you see where the house of Joseph is referring to all the tribes that were north of Judah. Abishai, he's the same guy who said while Shimei was doing the cursing, just let me kill the guy. Don't waste your breath on this guy. Shall not Shimei be put to death for us because he cursed the Lord's anointed? And David said, what have I to do with you? Notice he didn't say son of Zeruiah. Abishai and Joab and Asahel were brothers. So here's a hint at David's vindictiveness to Joab. He says, what have I to do with you, sons of Zeruiah, that you should this day be as an adversary? It's interesting that the Hebrew word there for adversary is Satan, Satan. That you should this day be as an adversary to me. Shall anyone be put to death in Israel this day? For do I not know that I am this day the king over Israel? He's issuing a pardon. And the king said to Shimei, you shall not die. And the king gave him his oath. We'll try to cover this in the next 6 minutes. What is forgiveness? What isn't forgiveness? And why does it matter? So how many different kinds of forgivenesses are there? There's really only one, because it's the real one, the complete one. But first of all, you see a conditional forgiveness. I will forgive you if. I will forgive you as soon as. I will forgive you if you come back and make things right. This comes from Swindoll. He says, you make your move and I'll decide whether it's time to back off or to attack. You not only have conditional forgiveness, you have partial forgiveness. I forgive you, but I won't forget. And I use this graphic example. Let's say Sean comes at me with a chainsaw and he takes my arm off. And I genuinely forgive Sean. First of all, it doesn't bring my arm back. But second of all, every time I try to do something, I remember that my arm is gone and I remember how it went. Forgiveness is to put away the right to remember. In that situation, I look at all that and I have to say to myself, I forgave Sean, and go on. Well, that leads to an interesting situation. What about forgiving yourself? Forgiveness is giving up the right to remember. And I will tell you, in my own life, I have done things that God has forgiven me and the people I have offended have forgiven me, but it still crops up in my brain, and I've got to deal with giving up the right to remember for me to forgive myself. Now, the book of Proverbs says this: the thought of foolishness is sin. If I dwell on that thing that I've been forgiven for, and you can put it into your own lives, whatever thing you had that you've been forgiven, you dwell on that thing, that's sin. My first pastor would define sin three ways. Sin is the transgression of the law. The thought of foolishness is sin. And he that knoweth to do good and doeth it not, to him it is sin. So, forgiving self. That stuff bubbles up in my brain, and I've got to tuck it away and tuck it away and tuck it away. And there's a person I know that has been done a lot of dirt. And this person comes to me many times and tries to explain to me the dirt that continues on, or replay the dirt had happened. And because we've already covered this particular notion, I would say to that person, you need to give up the right to remember. Delayed forgiveness. I'll forgive you, but just give me a little bit of time. Again, from Swindoll, we'd rather sit on the judgment seat than on the mercy seat. We'd rather see somebody squirm rather than give them some relief. I'll forgive you, just give me some time. This comes from Matthew. Then Peter came up and said to him, Lord, how often shall my brother sin against me? 7 times? And Jesus said to him, I do not say to you 7 times, but 77 times. Not 77 times, but 7 times 70. Where does that come from? If you're in the ESV or in the NIV, it'll tell you 77. If you're in the King James or the NASB, it will tell you 7 times 70. Now, what's interesting is that particular word, the one that suggests 70 times, only appears 1 time in Scripture, and that's right here. 77 verses 490. If there are multiples of 10 plus some units, it's translated this way: 70 souls, 70 souls, 16 souls. In the Old Testament, Daniel talks about 70 times 7. It talks about the 69 weeks that goes to the Messiah coming for the first round. It misses the church age, and then it gives the last 7 years. And so when in Bible times, when you hear 70 times 7, what it's saying is you're not going to forgive them just 7 times, but you're going to forgive them until Jesus Christ comes back. So imagine, have I forgiven even once? Got my tally board, say, okay, you blew it. There's 487, 489, 490. Up, you're toast. That tells me I've never forgiven him the first time. We're going to finish this topic and then we're going to break. What happens with anything less than complete forgiveness? There was an offense, and then things start growing on both sides. Resentment, hatred, grudge, revenge. Jesus is the only one. The Lord is the only one that's in the revenge, that should be in the revenge business. Examples of complete forgiveness. There's Jesus. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. There's Stephen. Lord, lay not their sin to their charge. And there's Corrie ten Boom. To forgive is to set a prisoner free and to discover the prisoner was you. That's an interesting quote, because the backstory to this is Corrie ten Boom, of course, survived the concentration camp. She became a world-renowned speaker. She's speaking on the subject of forgiveness, and the Nazi prison guard comes walking down the aisle and says, will you forgive me? And Corrie's testimony is she didn't want to, but she could just feel the rush of the Holy Spirit coming upon her. And she says, when he tells us to love our enemies, he gives us, along with the command, the love itself. She was enabled to forgive even that through the love of Christ. Did David completely forgive Shimei? I'll go through this quickly. Basically, David says to his son Solomon, Shimei is a scourge, and you're going to end up killing him. The very last verse. Is that David's revenge? Or is David simply prophesying that Shimei is going to fall out of the graces? I'll finish the Shimei story and then we'll quit. Shimei was forgiven by David. And then when Solomon became king, he said, you know, that's all fine, well, and good, but you stay inside the city of Jerusalem. Well, he did for 2-3 years, and then some of his slaves escaped, and Shimei goes and tracks them down in Philistia. And when he comes back, Solomon said, too bad for you, you left the city. And Shimei dies.